The first thing Sergeant Kayla Michaels heard when she came back to herself was the sound of her own breathing. Ragged, wet at the edges, and wrong in a way she couldn't name yet. The second thing she heard was the planet. It breathed too. That was the only word for it. A low, subsonic pulse that moved through the ground and up through her spine and into the back of her molars, where it hummed like a dead radio station. She had read the briefings. She had sat in the debrief rooms on Meridian Station and watched the intelligence reels with her arms folded and her jaw set and thought she understood what she was walking into. She hadn't. Nobody ever did. That was the first thing they stopped teaching at the academies, because no one had ever figured out how to teach it. That the briefings were always wrong, and that the planet was always stranger than the satellite data suggested, and that the only thing a soldier could ever really bring to an alien world was the stubborn animal fact of themselves. She sat up. That took longer than it should have. The shuttle was gone. Not crashed, gone. The landing struts had left 4 perfect circles in the gray-black soil, each rim scorched where the retros had fired, and the circles were already filling with something that looked like sap but moved like it was alive. Around her the forest, if you could call it that, pressed in from 3 sides. The trees were wrong in the specific way that alien flora was always wrong. Too tall, too still, too deliberately arranged, as if something had planted them with a plan in mind. Their bark was the color of old bone. Their leaves, if you called them leaves, were flat, hexagonal plates that caught the light from the twin moons and threw it back as faint violet. She checked herself first. That was protocol. Blood on her left forearm, a cut from the hatch breach during descent, already clotting in the dry alien air. Left knee swollen, probably from the impact when the shuttle shed its port, landing strut 3 meters above the ground. Her sidearm was still holstered. Her pack had survived. Her comm was not working. She already knew her comm was not working. She had known since 40 seconds before the shuttle disappeared. When Roz, Corporal Rosalind Tate, the best signals officer Kayla had ever served with, had said something that the static ate before it could reach her. Just her voice, not her words. That was the worst kind of message. The kind that told you something terrible had happened without telling you what. Kayla stood up. Her niece said something rude about that. She ignored it. She had a family. That was the fact she organized everything else around. She had a husband, Marcus, who had a habit of making coffee at 0400 because he could never sleep past it. And she could always find him in the kitchen before a deployment, sitting with his hands wrapped around a mug and not saying anything because there was nothing to say. She had a daughter, Zoe, who was 8, and had inherited her mother's jaw and her father's laugh, and nobody's patience for being told to go to sleep. She had a sister, Danny, who was going to give birth to her first child in 11 weeks and had made Kayla swear on something more binding than a deployment contract that she would be there for it. The planet pulsed beneath her boots. She was going to be there for it. The briefings had mentioned a settlement. They always mentioned a settlement, some cluster of prefabs or repurposed ranch where someone from an earlier mission had planted a flag and called it Progress. This one had a name, Outpost Vela, 214 kilometers northeast. If her suit's inertial navigation system could be trusted, and it couldn't, but it was what she had. 214 kilometers of a planet that the mission profile had classified as hostile restricted, which was the military's way of saying that it had killed enough people to make the paperwork inconvenient. She started walking. The first day was mostly just the forest. It moved in ways that suggested something other than wind, the hexagonal leaves reorienting themselves as she passed, the bone-pale branches shifting incrementally, the subsonic pulse changing in tempo when she stopped and changing back when she moved again. She tried not to read intention into it. She mostly failed. Soldiers who had been on alien worlds long enough developed a particular kind of vigilance that was useless on Earth, a way of watching everything and committing to nothing, holding every interpretation lightly because the one that got you killed was always the one you decided was definitely right. She ate at dusk. Her rations were designed for 2 weeks of field conditions, and she had 9 days' worth. She drank carefully from the suit's filtration system. She did not build a fire because nothing on this world would respond to fire the way fire worked at home, and she had learned that on her first alien post at the age of 23, when Sergeant Weiss had built a fire to keep warm, and something the size of a compact car had come to investigate the light. She slept for 4 hours, with her back against one of the bone-pale trees and her sidearm in her hand, and she dreamed about the kitchen at home, and Marcus's coffee, and Zoe's laugh. And she woke up before the dream could finish and lay there for a moment in the dark of the alien forest, listening to the planet breathe. Then she got up and kept walking. On the second day she found the first body, human, that narrowed things down considerably. The suit was from a different division, reconnaissance insignia, rank of specialist. No name tag because name tags were optional past the Meridian frontier, and most people who came out here didn't wear them. The specialist had been dead for some time. The cause was not immediately clear, which was in some ways more disturbing than if it had been obvious, because a wound told you something was out there. No wound told you nothing was, or else that whatever had done it had been subtle about it. She searched the body quickly and without sentiment, because sentiment was something you saved for when you had time for it. She found a broken comm unit, a water filtration tab she added to her pack, and a folded piece of physical paper, which was either someone being deliberately old-fashioned or someone who had been out here long enough to lose faith in digital media. She unfolded it, a map, hand-drawn, careful, with 2 landmarks she didn't recognize and one she did. A symbol that matched the iconography for the Kazaya, which the mission briefings had described in a paragraph that had probably been written by someone who had never met one. A footnote scrawled in the margin in a tight, exhausted hand. The Oracle knows. Find her first. Kayla looked at the map for a long time. Then she folded it and put it in her breast pocket, where she kept things she wanted to be sure she hadn't lost. The Kazia. She had read the briefing paragraph 3 times on the shuttle, the way she read anything that the bureaucracy had tried to make sound unimportant. The briefing called them indigenous. It called them non-hostile under most documented circumstances. It used the word elusive twice, and the word dangerous once, and the once was in a subordinate clause that was easy to overlook if you weren't paying attention. What the briefing had not said. Because the briefing had been written by people who were summarizing reports, written by people who were paraphrasing accounts, given by people who had mostly come back confused rather than informed, was what the Kazaya actually were. She was going to find out. The second night she heard them for the first time. Not the planet. That pulse was continuous, a geological fact, something she had stopped noticing the way you stopped noticing the hum of a ship's engines. This was different. High and complex, like harmonics played on an instrument with too many strings, and it moved through the air in a way that sound didn't normally move, not radiating outward but arriving from multiple directions at once, as if the forest itself was the instrument. She stood still and listened and felt the hair rise on the back of her neck, and did not reach for her sidearm, because the briefing had said one thing she trusted. They were watching, and what they watched for, above all things, was aggression. In the morning, she found that her route had been marked. Not on her navigation system, that was still drifting. On the ground, a pattern pressed into the gray-black soil, hexagonal impressions arranged in a line that curved northeast, with a precision that could not have been accidental. She stood at the start of the line and looked along it and thought about the specialist's map folded in her breast pocket and the scrawled words. Find her first. She followed the line. The terrain changed on the 3rd day. The forest thinned and gave way to something that might have been a plateau if the geography had been less alien. A raised expanse of flat stone the color of iron slag, scattered with formations that looked carved but weren't, or maybe were, depending on how you defined the verb. The subsonic pulse was stronger here. She could feel it in her teeth. She was resting against one of the formations, taking weight off her knee, which had graduated from swollen to actively architectural in its objections. When the Kazaya spoke to her for the first time, it said in English, "You're going the wrong way." She did not reach for her sidearm. She had decided that she would not reach for her sidearm, and she was going to honor that decision, and she only had to work at it for about 2 seconds before it became real. She turned slowly. The Kazaya was. She made herself really look, because the first reaction of a human brain to something genuinely alien was to try to fit it into a known category, and the known categories were always wrong. Tall, yes, but not in the way height worked for humans. It distributed itself differently, across its frame, folded into angles that suggested extra joints operating in planes she couldn't quite track. The surface she was looking at was not skin, and was not cloth, and was not armor, but something that partook of all 3, shifting through colors that she didn't have names for, which was its own kind of unsettling, because she had a wide vocabulary. Its face, if that was the word, was arranged for expression but not the same expressions as hers. She had no idea what it was currently expressing. That was, she realized, probably the point. Which way is right? She said. The Kazia tilted its head at an angle that should have been anatomically uncomfortable, and probably was, by human standards, and then said, the one that gets you to the Oracle. Are you the Oracle? A pause. The colors in its surface shifted through something she couldn't read. No, it said. I'm the one who decides if you're worth her time. Kayla Michaels had been in the service for 11 years. She had been evaluated, assessed, tested, and ranked by a number of entities both human and otherwise. And she had developed a way of receiving that information, steady, undefensive, curious about what she'd learn, that had served her well in every context she'd encountered so far. She used it now. She looked at the thing that was not the Oracle and said, all right, what do you need to know? What followed was not an interrogation, exactly, and not a conversation, exactly, and not the kind of test she'd been trained for, because it wasn't structured around what she knew. It was structured around what she was. The Kazaya asked her questions that didn't seem like questions, observations phrased as statements, silences that expected something, moments where it stopped moving entirely, and she understood instinctively that she was supposed to keep going without cue. It asked her about the specialist. It asked her what she'd felt when she found the body. It asked her about the map. It asked her in a way that was somehow both direct and oblique why she was still moving. My family, she said. The colors shifted again. Many creatures have families, it said. I know, she said. But they're mine. Something changed in the air between them, not the subsonic pulse. That was constant. Something else, a quality of attention she couldn't name. A sense of the forest leaning slightly closer. The Kazia was still for a long moment, and then it said something in its own language. The high harmonic chords she'd heard the night before, and the marks on the ground ahead of her shifted, rearranging themselves with a sound like pages turning. Come, it said, and began to move. Its name, she learned over the next 6 hours of walking, was something she couldn't pronounce, and it had offered her a human approximation without being asked, which she interpreted as a gesture of consideration. Roz. She didn't tell it that this was also the name of her missing signals officer. She wasn't sure why. Some things you kept inside yourself, not out of deception, but because they belonged to you, and the world was full enough of things that had been taken. The Kazia called Roz walked in a way that looked like it shouldn't work, but clearly did, navigating the terrain with the comfort of something that had grown up in it. It told her things about the planet without her asking. The hexagonal plates on the trees were a communication network, not photosynthesis. The subsonic pulse was biological, generated by root systems that covered the entire continent and functioned as something between a nervous system and a commons. The planet was, in a meaningful sense, alive and aware, and the Kazaya were not native to it any more than humanity was native to Meridian Station. They had arrived long ago, and the planet had decided they were acceptable. What does it take to be acceptable, she asked. Roz consists for what she was learning to recognize as its thoughtful pause. Willingness to be changed, it said. She thought about that for a kilometer or so. On the 4th day, she told it about Marcus and Zoe and Danny and the coffee at 0400 and the way Zoe laughed. She didn't know why she started talking. She was tired and her knee was a problem, and she had been alone with her own thoughts for long enough that the sound of her own voice in the alien air was almost physically comforting. Roz listened with the specific quality of attention that she was coming to recognize as its version of interest. The colors in its surface steadying, the ambient harmonic lowering slightly. A kind of focused quiet that said, I am attending to you. She sounds like someone worth returning to, it said, when she'd finished. All of them are, she said. Yes, it said. But you said her name differently. She didn't answer that. She didn't need to. The Oracle's location was not a place she'd have found on her own. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it required the kind of navigation that assumed you already knew where you were going. A series of turnings through terrain that all looked the same. A descent through a crack in the iron slag plateau that was barely shoulder width. A passage through a section of root network that the planet seemed to open for them as they approached and close again behind them. She focused on not reading metaphor into this. She mostly failed. The space at the end of it was large and dark and smelled of ozone and something older than ozone. Something that didn't have a name in any language she knew. The subsonic pulse was different here, not louder but deeper. A frequency that she felt in her chest rather than her teeth, and she recognized after a moment that it was matching itself to her heartbeat, and then adjusting her heartbeat towards something slower and more deliberate, which should have been alarming and instead was not. She made a note of that. "Wait here," Roz said, and moved into the dark. She waited. She was good at waiting. It was one of the things the 11 years had given her. Not patience, exactly, which implied a kind of resignation, but readiness, which was different. The ability to be still and present and exactly what the moment required without either rushing it or resisting it. The oracle came to her. She had expected something larger. Something that announced itself with spectacle. Because the briefings, for all their failures, had called it elusive, and things that were elusive were usually hiding something worth the effort of hiding. Instead, the oracle was small, no larger than a human child, and built along lines that were more similar to a human than the Kazuya were, though still wrong in the specific way everything here was wrong. Its surface was deep black and perfectly still, no shifting colors. Its eyes, when it turned them on her, were the color of the twin moons at full phase, and they held something she hadn't expected. Recognition. Not recognition of her specifically. Recognition of what she was. It spoke in the harmonic language first, several long passages of it, that she felt more than heard, and then it said in English so precise it sounded like it had been rehearsed, "Soldier, you are looking for a way home." "Yes," she said. "Why should I show you one?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it for 4 days of walking and pain, and watching a planet she didn't understand. Show her careful, unexplained gestures of guidance. And she had worked through several versions of an answer and discarded all of them, because they were all, at their root, arguments. Explanations, the architecture of justification, and she'd come to believe, in the slow way that you came to believe things that the planet itself was teaching you. That justification was not what was being asked for. "Because I'll go mad if I'm kept from them," she said, "and I'll do whatever it costs. And I'd like it to cost something real, not something that doesn't matter to anyone." The oracle was still for a long moment, then it said, "What will you give? What do you need?" Another pause. The subsonic pulse shifted, and she had the distinct impression that the conversation was happening on more levels than she could perceive. That the planet itself was involved in some deliberation she was only partly party to. That the roots beneath her feet were part of this exchange. That the hexagonal plates in the canopy above were oriented toward her and the oracle and the space between them. "Your signal," it said. She didn't know what that meant and said so. "The transmission," it said. "The one your ship sent before it left. The one your people used to find each other. We have been trying to understand it for 3 years, and we cannot, and it is beginning to cause harm." She stared at it. "You're talking about a distress beacon. We are talking about a frequency that interacts with our root network in a way that creates pain," it said, without accusation. "We have isolated it. We cannot stop it. We need a human to stop it." She thought about the specialist, about the broken comm unit, about the fact that the specialist's body had shown no wound. "Where is it?" she said. Roz led her to it the next morning. 12 kilometers east, at the edge of the plateau, half buried in the gray-black soil. A standard emergency beacon, model AF7, the kind that fired automatically on crash separation and ran for years on its own power cell. Its signal was strong and clean, and she could hear it on her suit's diagnostics. The familiar pulse of distress, the coded human cry that said, "We are here, we are here, someone come." The root network could feel it. She stood there and felt the planet flinch beneath her and understood, for the first time completely, that the briefings were not just insufficient but inverse. They had described the Kazuya as the dangerous ones, when in fact they had been living for 3 years, with a sound inside their nervous system that felt. She was beginning to understand from the oracle's description. Like a splinter driven into every nerve simultaneously, she crouched next to the beacon, looked at it for a moment, thought about what she was about to do. "This beacon will stop broadcasting," she said, "but you need to understand what that means. When it stops, my people stop looking for me in this location." "Yes," the oracle said. "It might take longer for them to find me." Yes, she thought about Danny. 11 weeks. The clock had been running for 4 days. She thought about Marcus in the kitchen at 0400, his hands around a mug, not saying anything. She thought about Zoe, who had inherited her jaw, and who would understand, when she was old enough to understand, what it meant that her mother had crouched in an alien forest and done the thing that cost something real. She popped the housing on the beacon, found the power coupling, disconnected it. The pulse stopped. The planet breathed differently. It was subtle, a loosening like a muscle finally unclenching, but she felt it in her teeth, which were now calibrated to the planet's frequencies in a way they hadn't been 4 days ago, and she thought, willingness to be changed. The oracle said something in its own language, long and complex, and the root network responded, the subsonic pulse shifting into something that was not, as far as she could tell, pain. Then it said, in English, come with us. What followed was 3 days she would spend years trying to describe accurately and mostly failing at. The Kazaya, not just Roz, but others, dozens of them, emerging from the forest in ways that made her understand she had been surrounded by them for the entire journey, moved with her northeast through terrain that the root network seemed to be actively rearranging. Not dramatically. Not in ways that would have been obvious to anyone who wasn't paying the kind of attention she had learned to pay. A clearing that hadn't been there the day before. A path along the plateau that circumvented a section of forest that Roz told her was temporarily closed for reasons that translated poorly. Water in a hollow she wouldn't have known to look for. She talked to Roz while they walked. Not about the mission, not about Outpost Vela, not about strategy or tactics or any of the things that the mission had been, in theory, about. She talked about Earth, about what it smelled like after rain, about the specific quality of light on a winter afternoon, that long horizontal gold that came in low through the windows and made everything in the room feel temporary and beautiful, about the way coffee smelled before it tasted like anything, about Zoe's laugh. Roz listened. Its surface cycled through colors she was beginning, tentatively, to read as something like wonder, though she held the interpretation carefully. Your world is very loud, it said, after she had described a city. Yes, she said, and you find that comfortable. She thought about it. No, she said, but it's ours. On the 6th day, they reached Outpost Vela. She smelled it before she saw it. The specific odor of human habitation, recycled air, and synthetic protein. And something she couldn't name that was just the accumulated presence of people who had been somewhere long enough to leave a mark. The perimeter sensors flagged her suit's IF, and the gate guard, Specialist First Class Dom Okafor, who had a face she'd never seen before, and eyes that said he'd been on this post long enough to stop expecting visitors, stared at her for a long moment, and then looked past her at the edge of the forest where the Kazaya had stopped. Sergeant Michaels, he said. Yeah, she said. He looked at the Kazaya again, then back at her. Were they with you the whole time, he said. She thought about the marks in the soil on the first morning. The path that had appeared and the path that had rearranged itself. The hollow that had appeared with clean water, the root network opening for them and closing behind them. In a manner of speaking, she said. She turned back to the forest edge. Roz was there, its surface cycling through colors she now understood, in a limited way as farewell. The oracle was not visible. The oracle, she suspected, was rarely visible and had made an exception, and she understood the weight of that. She raised her hand. It was not a military gesture. It was a human one. The simple, ancient, uncomplicated signal says, I see you. I was here. You mattered. Roz raised something in return. Not a hand, because the anatomy was wrong for it, but something that served the same function. The forest shifted its hexagonal plates toward her one last time, and then the Kazaya were gone. And the forest was just a forest again, which was to say that it was a plant's nervous system full of intentional history and the accumulated memory of everything that had ever moved through it. But she was only human, and she was inside a perimeter fence, and there was a comm unit in the outpost that Okafor said had a relay connection to Meridian Station, and she needed to make a call. The relay took 11 minutes to connect. She sat in the outpost signal room and watched a counter tick up and said nothing, because there was nothing to say while you were waiting. Her knee was on the full side of swollen now. Someone had given her coffee, which tasted wrong in the particular way that all coffee tasted wrong, when you had been outside long enough for your palate to reset itself. But she held the mug in both hands anyway, because the warmth was real. The connection opened. Marcus said, Kayla. Just her name. The way you said someone's name when you'd been saying it to yourself for a long time without being sure you'd ever say it out loud again. Hey, she said. A pause. She could hear the kitchen in the background, the specific acoustic of that room, the refrigerator's hum, the way the sound sat in the space that she'd memorized without knowing she was memorizing it. She thought about what the planet had taught her, the way it had taken everything, the briefings, the classified assessments, the accumulated human intelligence about this place, and rendered it approximately impressionistically, almost correct and therefore precisely wrong. You could know a place in theory and not know it at all. You could love a person from a distance and still need to be in the same room with them before the knowing was complete. Where are you, he said. Outpost Vela, she said. Northeast sector, I'm okay. Knee's a problem, but I'm okay. Danny called, he said. She's 11 weeks, Kayla said. I know. I'm coming home. You always say that. I always mean it. Another pause. She heard the refrigerator. She heard him exhale. The specific exhale of someone setting something down that had been heavy. Zoe, he said. She's been sleeping in your sweatshirt. Kayla pressed her lips together. Looked at the ceiling of the outpost signal room, which was prefab paneling with a water stain in one corner, and a crooked patch where someone had sealed a breach, the most human ceiling she'd seen in 6 days. She let herself have that for a moment. Just that. I'll be there before she runs out of sweatshirt, she said. The transit back to Meridian Station took 9 days. She wrote her report on the second day, in the prefab cabin of the transport ship, sitting on her bunk with a datapad on her knee and the stars going past the small porthole in their slow, indifferent way. She wrote it carefully, more carefully than she usually wrote these things, because she wanted to get it right. The mission profile had been reconnaissance and assessment, which was the military's way of saying that someone had decided this planet was a candidate for something, and they wanted to know if the candidate had objections. She wrote that the planet did. She wrote about the beacon and the root network, and the quality of pain that a human distress signal produced in a continent spanning biological nervous system. And she documented the 3-year timeline, and she included her best estimate of how many reconnaissance casualties over the last decade might be attributed to a planet that had been defending itself against involuntary acoustic assault rather than exhibiting generalized xenophobia, which was what the briefings had implied. She wrote it in the flat, precise language that reports were supposed to be written in, because the flat, precise language was what people in the position to act on it were trained to read. Then she added an appendix. The appendix was not standard. She had never written an appendix in 11 years of reports. It was 2 pages long, and it said, in language that was as precise as she could make it, what she had observed about the Kazaya, not their classification, not their tactical profile, not the security assessment that was standard in this section of the report, but what they actually were. The music of their language. The colors in Roz's surface, when it listened to her, describe her daughter. The way the Oracle had asked for something real, and then given something real in return. The marks in the soil on the first morning that had said, "We will help you, but you have to start." The appendix concluded, "This planet has decided that humans are acceptable. The question is whether we will make the same decision about it. I recommend we ask the question before we make the decision for ourselves." She submitted the report from Meridian Station 2 days after she landed. She did not know what would happen to the appendix. She had learned in 11 years that the things you couldn't control were the things you couldn't control, and the things you could control were the things in front of you, and the thing in front of her now was a transit corridor in a space station, and a departures board and a shuttle to Earth with her name on the manifest. She got on it. Danny called at the 2-hour mark. Kayla picked up and said, I know, I'm on my way." And Danny said something that was half laugh and half something else and told her she had 12 days to go, from launch to couch, or she was being removed from the birth plan. And Kayla said, 8.5, I'll be there. And Danny said, I hate you, which was the family shorthand for the opposite. She slept for most of the transit. She dreamed about the kitchen, which was becoming a recurring event, and this time the dream went all the way to the end. Marcus at the table. Zoe's chair scraped back, the coffee cooling in the pot. All of them there and not saying anything, because there was nothing to say and everything was present in the saying of nothing. She woke up over Pacific airspace. Earth from 2,000 meters was green and gray, and lit with the particular quality of winter light she'd described to Roz. That long horizontal gold coming in through the cloud cover, catching the tops of things and leaving the rest in shadow. It looked, as it always looked after a long absence, like something she hadn't quite believed in until she saw it again. The shuttle touched down at 0600. She was through the terminal in 12 minutes because she'd been through enough of them to know which lines moved and which lines didn't. The transport to the city was 40 minutes. Her street was quiet in the early morning, the way it was quiet when the world hadn't woken up to itself yet. She stood in front of the house for a moment. The light was on in the kitchen. She went up the walk. 3 steps, she knew the count without counting, and tried the door, which was unlocked because Marcus had always been too trusting, and she was home. Zoe was at the table in a sweatshirt that was 7 sizes too large for her. eating cereal with the particular focused intensity that 8-year-olds brought to cereal. And she looked up when the door opened and her face went through a sequence of expressions too fast to fully track. Surprise, recognition, something older than both of those. Something that understood what an absence meant and what a return meant. That had been learning these things in the long months that Kayla had been out past the meridian frontier. Then she pushed back her chair so fast it scraped against the floor and she ran. And Kayla went to one knee despite what that cost her knee. And her arms were full of her daughter, and the sweatshirt was hers, and it still smelled like home. Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway with his hands around a mug, and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say. She held her daughter and felt the planet's pulse fade out of her teeth. Gone finally, replaced by the particular frequency of Earth, of home, of the small irreplaceable fact of her own life. The Kazia had been right, willingness to be changed. She had walked into that forest one kind of soldier, and walked out of it another, and the difference was not something she could classify or report, or translate into the flat precise language of mission outcomes. The difference was this: she'd sat in the dark of an alien planet and been asked why she was still moving, and she had said, "My family." T and the planet had listened and decided she was acceptable. She held her daughter tighter. The coffee machine started cycling in the kitchen. She was home. She had 9 days before the outpost's next resupply shuttle was scheduled to arrive, and she spent them working. This was how she had always processed things, by finding the thing she could actually do and doing it until the larger problem either resolved itself or became small enough to hold in one hand. At Outpost Vela there was no shortage of things to do. The facility was understaffed by a third, running on equipment that was 2 generations past its service date, and staffed by people who had been out here long enough to develop the specific 1,000-yard quality that long deployments produced. She recognized it in their faces the way she recognized it in her own face in the mirror, the look of someone who had spent enough time on the outside of the familiar that they had started to lose the threat of it. She did not want to lose the threat of it. Dom Okafor showed her the outpost on her second day. The comm shack, the equipment bays, the small hydroponics unit that kept them in something that was technically vegetables if you didn't look too closely at the definition. He had been here 14 months, which was 3 months past the standard rotation. And he explained this in the tone of someone who had stopped expecting an explanation in the other direction. The resupply shuttle brought personnel changes when it brought them at all. Sometimes it didn't bring them. "How many of you have been outside the perimeter?" she asked. He looked at her carefully. "Define outside," he said. "Past the sensor line. Into the forest." "2," he said, "in 14 months. Neither of them came back." She thought about the specialist's body, the folded map, the word Oracle written in exhausted, careful hand. Did either of them have beacons? He didn't answer immediately, which was its own answer. "Everyone carries a beacon," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I know." She spent that evening in the equipment bay with a bench full of AF-7s. The standard issue emergency beacons that every suit carried and every installation kept in reserve, and a soldering kit. And she'd worked through until 300 making a modification that was not in any manual because no manual had been written for a situation this specific. She altered the frequency, not the signal itself. A beacon that didn't signal was useless, but the harmonic envelope around it, the part that wasn't formally part of the transmission but was an artifact of the power cycling, the electronic breathing of the thing. She shifted it out of the range that the root network was apparently sensitive to, and she tested it on the bench. And then she tested it in the sensor logs against what she remembered of the Oracle's description of the offending frequency. And then she sat back and looked at what she'd made. It would need testing outside the perimeter. That was the thing. You could do everything right in a lab and be wrong in the field. She knew this better than most. In the morning she told Okafor what she'd done and what she needed to do next, and he looked at the modified beacon and then at her and said, "I'm going with you." "No," she said. "I outrank you in this facility," he said. "You're a specialist first class," she said. "I'm a sergeant." A pause. "I've been here 14 months, he said. "I know," she said. "That's why you're staying." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the bench full of modified beacons, and at the door of the equipment bay, and at the forest visible through the narrow port window. Something moved in his face that she recognized. The look of someone doing the arithmetic between what they wanted to do and what they understood. "Be back by 0800, he said. "I'll be back by CISO 600, she said. She crossed the perimeter at 0430 in the gray pre-dawn that the twin moons produced when they were both below the horizon and the planet was at its darkest. The forest received her the way it always had, not silently, because nothing here was ever silent, but with the quality of attention that she now understood was the planet's version of watching. The modified beacon pulsed on her suit's diagnostic panel. She went 2 kilometers in and stopped, in a clearing that she recognized, faintly, as one that had not been there before her arrival, and she waited. The marks appeared in the soil within 20 minutes. Hexagonal impressions, the same as before, arranged in a pattern she couldn't read, but had come to understand as the planet's version of hello. She crouched down and pressed her palm flat against the ground, the way she'd seen Roz do once, briefly, communicating something she hadn't been able to translate. The subsonic pulse ran through her palm and up her arm and into her chest, and found her heartbeat and matched itself to it, and she waited to see if the matching would change, and it did. A shift in the frequency, subtle but unmistakable, in the direction she associated with the word she'd heard the oracle use. Acceptable, she stood, looked at the forest, raised her hand. Nothing appeared at the tree line, but the hexagonal plates on the nearest trees reoriented themselves toward her. All of them at once, and held that position for a count of 3. She took it for what it was worth. She was back at the perimeter at 05455. Okafor was waiting at the gate. He looked at her without speaking for a moment, reading whatever was in her face, and then he said, "Well, the modification works," she said. "The root network's not reacting to the modified frequency." "How do you know?" "Because the forest didn't do anything to me," she said. "He processed this. And that tells one if modification works." "Yes," she said. "Because previously," he said carefully, "the forest doing nothing to people, and the forest doing something to people had the same outcome." She thought about the specialist again. The broken comm unit, the map, the body with no wound. "There's a difference," she said, "between nothing happening and something watching, and deciding to let you through." He looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at the modified beacons on the bench inside the equipment bay door, 9 more of them, all waiting. "How long to modify the rest of the facility stock?" he asked. 8 hours, she said. "Maybe 6 if you help." He was good with a soldering kit, it turned out. Better than her. His hands were steadier, and he'd been doing small equipment work for 14 months with no formal support. They finished in 5.5 hours. She walked him through the reasoning as they worked. Not because she needed to talk it through, but because he deserved to understand it. And because she had learned something, in 6 days on the wrong side of everything, about the difference between information shared and information reported. The information reported would go in her addendum. Dry language, precise reasoning, recommended technical modifications, proposed protocol changes. It would go up the chain and come back down in some form, maybe the form she'd intended, maybe not. That was the nature of chains. The information shared was just for him. It was, "This planet is alive, and it has been in pain, and it decided to help me anyway, and the least we can do is stop hurting it by accident." It was, "The Kazia showed me a path I couldn't have found, and an oracle asked me a question I almost gave the wrong answer to. And what saved me was not my training, or my equipment, or my rank, but the fact that I was thinking about my daughter when I said what I said. It was, we have been treating this planet like a problem, and it has been treating us like a puzzle, and I know which of those framings leads somewhere worth going." Okafor listened to all of this while he soldered. He didn't ask questions until she was finished, and when he asked them, they were good ones. Practical, specific, grounded in the 14 months he'd spent watching the forest through the port windows of a facility that had lost 2 people to it. "Were they afraid?" he asked the Kazaya. "No," she said, "but I think they were cautious. The way you're cautious around something that has a history of doing damage without meaning to." He looked at the forest through the port window. "That's us," he said. "Yes," she said. "That's us." The resupply shuttle arrived on schedule, and she was on it when it left, and she sat in the observation module and watched Vela fall away below her. The Iron Slag Plateau, the Bone Pale Forest, the twin moons just rising on the horizon. And she wrote the last section of her addendum as the planet shrank to a point, and then to nothing. And she wrote it knowing that it was the most important field report she had ever submitted in 11 years. And it also the most likely to be set aside by someone who had never walked on ground that was alive beneath their feet. She submitted it anyway. You did what you could with what you had. That was also what it meant to be human. The transit was long. She slept more than usual, which was the body's way of processing things, It hadn't had time to process during the doing of them. She dreamed about the oracle, sometimes, and about the marks in the soil on the first morning, and about the way the planet's pulse had matched her heartbeat in the clearing before dawn and shifted itself towards something it recognized as acceptable. She woke from these dreams feeling neither rested nor unrested but altered, like a person who has spent time in a room that has changed them, and can't yet see the shape of the change, but can feel it in the way they hold themselves. She reached Meridian Station and cleared customs and took the first earthbound transit she could get her name on, and she sat in the departure lounge with her pack between her feet and her report submitted, and her modified beacon deactivated, and nothing left to do but wait, which she was good at, and she waited. An officer, she didn't know, stopped by her seat on the way through the lounge. She recognized the collar insignia, Command Division, which meant the report had gone somewhere already. The officer looked at her for a moment and said, "Sergeant Michaels, sir," she said. A pause. "Your appendix," the officer said. "The last section." "Yes, sir." "The recommendation about reclassification." Another pause. "It's being reviewed," she nodded. She didn't know what that meant. Reviewed could mean anything. In her experience, reviewed most often meant held, which was a gentler word for set aside, but not always. Sometimes it meant something had caught on something. Some sentence in the flat, precise language had hooked into someone who had the position to pull on it, and had decided to pull. "Good," she said. The officer nodded and moved on. She watched him go and thought about the appendix. The 2 pages she'd written in the flat, precise language, the part about the Kazaya that she'd tried to get right, the conclusion that she'd written and rewritten until it said exactly what she meant and nothing more. She thought about whether it was enough. Then she thought about Zoe in the oversized sweatshirt eating cereal at a 600, and Marcus in the kitchen doorway, not saying anything, and Danny's voice at the 2-hour mark halfway between a laugh and something more. And she thought that the report would do what the report could do, and the rest was not hers to carry. Her flight was called. She shouldered her pack, and she walked to the gate, and she went home.